Mr. Chris Barr is a park guide at Andersonville National Historic Site. He is a 2001 graduate of America's High School. He holds a bachelor's degree in history from Georgia Southwestern State University and a master's in history education from Columbus State University. Prior to joining the National Park Service, he was a teacher in the Sumter County school system in Americus, Georgia, where he taught U.S. history, civics, and economics. Currently, he is working on a research project entitled The High Watermark of Slavery, the evolving meanings of freedom and emancipation at Andersonville Prison. And he's going to speak on that tonight. Please help me in welcoming Chris Barr. Yeah, my little spiel, but anyway, Chris won't officially start his presentation until we hear from our very own Luther Harris and the Albany Civil Rights Institute Freedom Songs. After that, oh God, I just messed up, Joy. Joy, you were supposed to bring the welcome.
No one would have known.
And y'all just take mine, and then after Joy brings the welcome, we're gonna have the freedom sing, and the next person you'll hear will be Mr. Christopher Barr.
All right. She gets excited. She gets anxious. Well, good evening, everyone. How are you all doing?
Good.
Okay, well, as I was telling Ms. Blaylock, no one knows if we mess up because no one knows the program necessarily. I mean, it's there, but no one we would have pretty much thought that it was just, you know, an updated program. But we want to thank you all for coming out tonight. We have Community Night every fourth Thursday of the month at 6:30, so mark your calendar. So just know that you will, you know, have a great experience every fourth Thursday of the month at 6:30. It is free to the public. If you like history and if you like to be educated, come out. It is a free experience, and you know, maybe you can go back and have some experience and tell your children, or maybe if you're a teacher, you can have something to tell your students. We would like to thank Mr. Chris Barr for coming from the Andersonville National Historic Site. We also would like to acknowledge Mr. John Bennett, superintendent there, and also we would like to acknowledge board members that are here. So if you're here in your board, please raise your hand or stand. And let's give them a round of applause. Also, we would like to thank Ms. Luther Harris and the Freedom Singers, because you all are going to get a treat tonight.
Amen.
Okay? So we thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoyed tonight's presentation.
Good evening.
Good evening.
The Freedom Singers, as you know, we are normally here every second Saturday of the month from 1 o'clock until 3. And we are in the old church. We normally tell the story behind the songs and how the songs came about. On your program, you see they have 2 selections they'd like for us to do. I woke up this morning with my mind on freedom and this little light of mine. So I'm just going to give you just a brief narrative and kind of give you a little bit of preview of what we normally do every second Saturday of the month from 1 o'clock until 3. As you know, music has always been a strong part of the culture of people of color. The music that we sing came from slavery, was brought over, and at one time the songs represented the time of sorrow, so they were known as sorrow songs, songs of lament. Then during the underground movement, they became songs of communication to help guide slaves to freedom. And then after the Civil War, the interest sort of went down, and the Gospel Jubilee Choir, Fifth Jubilee Choir sort of brought the songs back into play, so then they became known as gospel songs. And from the influence of those songs, it went on to become the roots for blues, jazz, country, rap, R&B, and the things that we listen to now. I woke up this morning with my mind on freedom. Originally was started by the Freedom Riders. So a lot of our songs generated during the time of the Freedom Riders. And they would have freedom schools. This particular song, a Reverend Osby from Hinds County, Illinois, was in Mississippi, in Aurora, Mississippi at one time, sitting in jail. And during in jail time, they would do a lot of singing, a lot of praying. And he started singing this song. I woke up this morning with my mind on freedom, which was originally, I woke up this morning with my mind on Jesus. Made his way to Bay High School when they were protesting the murder of a young man named Herbert Lee, who was killed during the Civil Rights Movement. Made his way to Albany, Georgia, when Charles Sherrod and Bernard Lafayette started singing it in jail during a protest of public transportation. I woke up this morning with my mind on freedom. This Little Light of Mine is that kind of song that needs to be shouted. Some songs you kind of sing a little low. This is a song that you shout. And this song is kind of like the signature song of one of our original members, Miss Rutha Harris. And we're going to leave you with this Little Light of Mine because that's what we want you to do, allow your light to shine. I woke up this morning with my mind on freedom.
I woke up this morning with my mind on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind set on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind set on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. I'm walking and talking with my mind. I'm Geneva Johnson.
Geneva Fields.
Arthur Watkins.
Rutha Harris.
Angie Kane Gibson.
Shirley Henry.
Victoria Johnson.
Wow. Okay. I need you guys to come and open up every program that I give from here on out. And I'm also very excited. You guys, the Freedom Singers, will be performing this weekend in America. So I'm personally excited that get a little sneak preview here. As noted, I've been working over the last year or so on a project, and this research project has been entitled "The High Watermark of Slavery." All right, the evolving meanings of freedom and emancipation at Andersonville Prison. And so, as many of you guys may know, we're in the midst of the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. For many, this sesquicentennial should mirror the centennial events of the 1960s in their pomp and grandeur. But for many Americans, the 1960s were not a time to celebrate a distant past, but a time to struggle for a meaningful future. In the summer of 1962, thousands celebrated the anniversary of the defense of Richmond from the invading Yankee hordes, while at the same time Dr. Martin Luther King sat in jail in this very city. In September of 1862, President Abraham Lincoln issued his preliminary draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. 100 years later, almost to the day, James Meredith was denied admission to the University of Mississippi. In June of 1963, Medgar Evers was murdered in his own driveway. 3 weeks later, tens of thousands descended on the city of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania to celebrate the Civil War and patriotically wave the flags that had recently begun to appear at rallies around the country, although for different reasons. 3 weeks after that, some 30 young black girls were arrested in Americus and imprisoned in nearby Leesburg for 45 days in conditions of captivity not seen in this area since. We'll talk more about that later. Ironically, some of these arrests took place on the 100th anniversary of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry's famous and celebrated assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina. As the state of Georgia prepared to celebrate the great Confederate victory at Chickamauga, 4 little girls were killed in a Birmingham church bombing. In 1964, many began to remember and mourn the losses suffered in 1864. But for millions around the country, 1964 was a time of more upheaval, but slowly increasing victories. The year began with the ratification of the 24th Amendment banning poll taxes. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned discrimination. The next year, in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed. When the U.S. Postal Service issued in 1965 a mournful stamp commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Confederate surrender at Appomattox, it bore the phrase taken from President Lincoln's second inaugural address, "with malice towards none." For those that made the Selma to Montgomery march less than 3 weeks prior, the call for malice towards none rang empty. Emancipation may have been won in 1865, but for those crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge that week, or that month, the battle continued. That brings us to today. In an effort to connect the story of the 1860s to the 1960s, and even to the present, the National Park Service has adopted the phrase Civil War to Civil Rights as the theme for the sesquicentennial, or 150th anniversary of the Civil War. For many around the country, the 150th anniversary of the Civil War has been more of a time for solemn commemoration rather than the odd festivals of the centennial in the 1960s. Many national parks are making a genuine effort to connect these stories. Earlier this month, several 100,000 visitors again descended on Gettysburg, only this time they heard a speech connecting the story of the 1860s to the 1960s. Again, just last week, at least 9 national park sites commemorated the 150th anniversary of the famous 54th Massachusetts assault on Fort Wagner. For example, the park rangers, the staff at Boston African American National Historic Site, did programs at the Shaw Memorial in Boston, and they passed out cards from Andersonville on Corporal James Gooding. And if I can find one, we've got some of these cards over there on the side table. Y'all feel free to grab you some at the end. I'll talk more about him in just a minute. Unfortunately, for many Americans, just aren't paying that much attention, though, to the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. It's understandable, given the chaos of the 1960s and the recent events that have dominated the news, including the controversial Trayvon Martin case and the recent Supreme Court decision involving the Voting Rights Act, that some might view any Civil War commemoration or celebration with a healthy dose of skepticism. For evidence of this skepticism, look no further than Andersonville National Historic Site. If you visit the site today, you'll see remarkably few African Americans. I once gave a program in the cemetery, and I talked about the evolution of the site, which included a stop in the old segregated section of the cemetery. An African American visitor on this program then remarked to one of our other fellow park rangers that she had no idea that this story existed. She always thought Andersonville was a Confederate place. Perhaps for a generation of African Americans who grew up in the Jim Crow South and in many cases endured captivity themselves, visiting a Civil War prison, especially one whose story has been dominated by a Confederate interpretation, probably doesn't seem like that meaningful of a thing or that good of an idea. But this was not always the case at Andersonville. And Andersonville was once a site rich in tradition and celebration for the African American community. In operation from February of 1864 until the spring of 1865, Andersonville was the largest of the Civil War military prisons. Some 45,000 Union soldiers, American soldiers, suffered in brutal conditions, and nearly 13,000 of them died, making this the deadliest site of the Civil War. After the war, a freedmen's school was established and moved into some of the old prison buildings, including the hospital. Then in 1871, the American Missionary Association sent the Reverend Floyd Snelson. Okay, we'll disregard all those. In 1871, the American Missionary Association sent the Reverend Floyd Snelson, once a student at the Andersonville Freedmen's School and a recent graduate of the newly established Atlanta University, now Clark Atlanta. I'm sure some of you guys may be alum of there. They sent him to, and I quote, that gloomy spot where was left the high watermark of slavery, Andersonville. Now, why would an organization like the American Missionary Association call Andersonville, of all places, the high watermark of slavery? You know, to us, there's better places that could bear that title. Maybe an original slave quarter somewhere. Perhaps even Fortress Monroe National Monument, where hundreds of slaves found freedom under the label as contraband of war. However, for that last generation of slaves here in South Georgia, Andersonville became the center of memory and celebration of the war, its meaning, and its outcomes, not for white veterans, but for the African American community. When we think about it, this makes sense. The entire story of Andersonville is closely intertwined with the story of slavery in America, its existence, its role in the Civil War, its end, its memory, and sadly, its return through segregation. Andersonville existed because of slavery and the civil rights of black soldiers. Passed in the spring of 1863, the U.S. government established a set of policies called the Lieber Codes, which demanded equality of treatment for all of its soldiers should they be captured, which, as many of you know, in the spring of 1863 began to include increasing numbers of African American soldiers. The Confederate government then responded by passing their own policy in which they said that any captured black soldier would not be subject to the laws of war. They would be turned over to the states for prosecution. We've mentioned the 54th Massachusetts. They made their famous assault. Many of you guys have seen the movie Glory, the big climax at the end. Some 25 black soldiers from the 54th were taken prisoner in that assault. They don't show that in the movie, but they were taken prisoner. And they were not exchanged under the previous system. They were actually jailed in the Charleston City Jail for 17 months. And they were actually prosecuted for trying to start a slave rebellion under South Carolina's laws. These are United States soldiers, men who are in the uniform, who have enlisted as American soldiers, and here they are being prosecuted as criminals Well, when President Lincoln and the United States government got wind of this, they shut down the prison exchange. They told the Confederacy, they said, listen, if you guys are not going to exchange all of our soldiers, then we won't exchange any of them. All right. Now, that meant that both sides had to start holding prisoners. And that leads to the creation of Andersonville. Without that policy, without this story of slavery and the demand for equality of all soldiers, Andersonville doesn't exist. Andersonville was also a site of slavery itself. And today, it is a place where we can still see the fruits of their labor. Andersonville, we'll step back here and play with the map. I used to be a high school teacher, and I like to do this some. All right, what we're looking at is a map taken from the 1860 census, showing the slave population throughout the Deep South. Basically, the darker the counties, the higher the population of slaves was. Andersonville is right in the heart of slave country. The prison site constituted, by the end, it constituted a 26-acre field and was completely surrounded with pine log stockade walls. It was surrounded by earthworks. All of these had to be cut down. All these trees had to be cut down. All of this work had to be done. And the Confederate Army did not do it themselves. They impressed slaves to do it. As many as 900 slaves were forced into labor at Andersonville. We actually have the story of one of those slaves. We can tell you his name, and we can hear his voice a little bit. There was a slave, he was born in Crawford County. His name was Tynes Kendrick. And he recalled in the 1930s in an interview, when he was well over 100 years old, by the way, he said, and I'm quoting him here, he says, "That was the worst place I ever saw. That," from Andersonville, "was where they kept all the Yankees that they captured, and they had so many there they couldn't take care of them, and they never had enough room for all them Yankees. The most they had to eat for them was peas, and the filth, it was just terrible. And they just died like rats what had been poisoned." For plantation owners in the Deep South, if they had a certain number of slaves, if they owned a certain number of slaves, they were required to, and the Confederate government used this term, tithe 10% of their property to the Confederate war effort, which included slave labor. So if a plantation owner owned 100 slaves, he was required to tithe, and I know that's weird to hear that term in that context, he was required to tithe 10% of his slaves, 10 slaves, to the Confederate war effort, which meant slaves like Tynes Kendrick working at Andersonville. Now, Andersonville is also a place where you can still see their labor. Now, you can't see this very well, but surrounding the site today are earthworks, earthen fortifications. Those were built by slaves. As you walk into the site, as you walk the site today, there are very few places today where you can see the fruits of slave labor. And most visitors, they come out and they look at it and go, "Man, that's horrible. There's cannon. It's facing at the prisoners. Man, this is scary stuff." But you can also go there and contemplate, whose hands built this? Whose hands built this? Oh, there we go. All right. Now, Andersonville was also a site of slave resistance. Slaves recognized that their freedom and the freedom of those American soldiers held prisoner there were intertwined. And this is captured in the Winslow Homer painting near Andersonville. Many of you guys may be familiar with Winslow Homer. He was an American painter. And in 1866, he painted this and he titled it "Near Andersonville." And in it, you've got a slave woman standing at the doorstep, standing at the threshold. And I know it's kind of dark and hard to see, but down at her feet are different symbols. There's a gourd at her feet. There's a dipper at her feet. And she's looking, and off in the distance you can see Union soldiers being taken to Andersonville, and she's looking at them, and she knows that when they're free, she will be free. They're looking at her, and why they're fighting all of a sudden becomes very real. Now, this idea of slave resistance, because these slaves recognized that their fates were intertwined, they had an interest in helping the prisoners. They had an interest in resisting. Even though this woman here might not have been a member of the United States Army, she's still fighting this war. She's still fighting this war. For example, there was a prisoner named George Tibbles, and when he attempted an escape, and an enslaved blacksmith smuggled him a knife. The slave couldn't, the rules and laws of the time, the slave wasn't going to be able to do a whole lot with that, but he got it in the hands of somebody who could. they're fighting this war. They're fighting for their own freedom. And so Tibbles later recalled when he testified before Congress, he said, "That knife given me by the old Negro blacksmith at Andersonville was of the greatest service in assisting in our travels. During this tedious journey, the Negroes along the route were always our friends. And when they were satisfied that we were Yankee prisoners, they often risked their lives to aid us and always shared with us their scanty food." Again, they risked their lives at Andersonville because they knew that their own lives depended on it. Andersonville is also a place where white Americans could see slavery firsthand for an extended period. That doesn't happen very often. If you're a Northerner, and if you're a white Northerner, you may have met a slave once. Maybe you saw Frederick Douglass speak one time. You might have heard somebody talk about it. You might have read a book. But you had probably never seen slavery for how cruel it was. It was an abstract construct. But these prisoners, if anybody's ever been to Andersonville, you know the layout of the geography is, you're kind of down in this valley and you can see everything happening on the outside. And they can see these 900 slaves. They can see the way that they're being treated. They can see the labor they're being forced to do. And again, why this war is being fought begins to become crystallized with these soldiers, who as individuals maybe weren't sure, becomes very real for them once they're in prison. They could see slavery, the brutality of it. There was a number of black prisoners that were held prisoner at Andersonville, a number of black soldiers held prisoner, and one of them was named Isaac Hawkins. He was from the 54th Massachusetts as well. And numerous prisoners testified, both in the trial of Henry Wirtz, who was the prison commandant, but also in congressional testimony afterwards. They testified that Hawkins, for some minor transgression, was taken up to the prison headquarters, which is up on the south field of the prison site. If you're down inside, you can see this. Every prisoner can see it. And he was stripped naked and tied up on a tree stump and was whipped 250 times, with the instructions that if he ever misbehaved again, and he hadn't done anything to begin with, that he would be whipped 250 more times. If you're a white Northerner and you're looking up at that, again, what this war is about begins to become very real for you. Andersonville prison was also a place where these northern white Americans could experience slavery in a sense. I know that sounds weird to say, but this may be the only place in our nation's history where that happens. For years, southern plantation owners had been perfecting how do you control large masses of people that are resisting you. Maybe it includes hounds chasing you down. Maybe it includes iron collars. All of these implements were used on the prisoners. Prisoners are whipped. Prisoners are put in iron collars and shackles. Prisoners are put in ball and chain. Prisoners are chased down by the hounds. In post-war literature, the hounds of Andersonville chasing these prisoners. They're huge. It's all in the stuff. But I often tell visitors, stop and think for a minute, why does the South have hounds that know how to track people? Their stories are intertwined. For a generation that grew up reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, now these hounds are chasing you. Getting to the river is how you're going to reach freedom. Simon Legree is no longer a fictional character. He's the prison commandant sitting up on the hillside overlooking you. Now, Andersonville is also a place where slavery ends and where freedom is discovered. In 1865, in the summer of 1865, there we go. In the summer of 1865, the U.S. Army sent an expedition to Andersonville to identify the graves, and accompanying them was the famous nurse, Clara Barton, who went on to found the American Red Cross later in life. She records in her diary on August 1st, 1865 at Andersonville, she says, "Two darky men came 16 miles to see me and obtain information upon certain points, one of which was to know if Master Lincoln was really and truly dead. They had heard so, but would not believe the people that told them. The people were also rejoiced at it," this is the local white population was rejoiced, "that all the colored people thought it might just be made up to trouble them, and be more as they were told, in some instances that in consequence of it, they were not free and never would be. They thought if I told them, then they should believe it." For many slaves who were living in rural Georgia at the time, they're being told, no, you're not really free. Lincoln's dead. They're coming to Andersonville to ask the questions. They're coming to Andersonville. Many slaves show up at this place of captivity and discover their own freedom. Andersonville is also then a place where freedom was celebrated and experienced. We mentioned a freedmen's school was built there. In January of 1866, the town of Norwich, Connecticut sent an expedition to dig up some of the Union soldiers, some of the American soldiers who had died there. And they sent a newspaper reporter down. And this newspaper reported, he said, and I'm quoting him here, "A few blacks live in the neighborhood, and some of these gathered around, and with tears streaming down their cheeks testified to the depth of their affection for those whom they esteemed as their deliverers. Poor Yanks, said they, our dead were as precious relics, and with their streaming eyes and wailing lamentation showed with what veneration and love they looked upon the mortal remains of those through whose sufferings and death a race rose up from chains." The black community visited Andersonville in droves. Not to be sad, not to look out and go, wow, these guys had it bad. They went to this place, this dreary place, to celebrate their own freedom. The prison buildings, the guards' huts, these all became the freedmen's homes. The stockade logs that once made the prison, those were taken down and were used to build the first homes of free men. The National Cemetery in 1864 and 1865 and into the early 1860s, or late 1860s, was totally integrated. Black and white prisoners are buried among each other. Unless you just happen to know their names, you have no idea if they're black or white. In 1867, a regiment of USCT, United States Colored Troops, who had died in camp in Macon, not in prison camp, but just kind of in camp, they were integrated into the cemetery post-war. These celebrations continued. In 1869, there was an Emancipation Day service to celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation. January 1st, 1869, our friend Reverend Floyd Snelson, who I referenced earlier, he was there, and he was the leader of the group. And they marched through the cemetery, down the same avenues that are there today, singing patriotic songs, singing hymns. And they concluded their service by gathering around the flagpole and singing. Decoration Day. Some of you guys are familiar with the term Decoration Day. Nowadays we call it Memorial Day. But that holiday, nowadays we look at it and it's just a holiday. Hey, we're all going to get out. We're going to tell the troops thanks. We're going to go out and we're going to have a day off work. But this was an exclusively black holiday at Andersonville. The local white population didn't want to have anything to do with this. This was a Yankee place. If you're a Southern white, you don't want to have anything to do with them folks. But think back to our map earlier. Who's the majority population down here? Memorial Day is a time to celebrate at Andersonville. It was so much so that the local newspaper, often referred to it as Colored Folks Day at Andersonville. This took place until the late 1880s. The crowds reached into the thousands. Many of you have been to a national cemetery. Maybe have even been to Andersonville before on Memorial Day. And it's a sight to see. You see thousands of flags. Every grave gets a flag. That was done exclusively by African Americans from the late 1860s until 1891. We often tell soldiers, we see them all the time, hey, thanks for our sacrifice. Tell the soldiers thanks for your sacrifice for securing our freedoms. But what these guys are doing, they're doing that, but it's in a very literal sense. It's not in this distant, abstract, hey, thanks for securing our freedom. They're saying, thanks for securing our freedom. Those same rail lines that bring these thousands, and it's numbering 3,000 to 5,000 every year at Memorial Day. These same rail lines that are bringing these local African Americans in are the same rail lines that brought these prisoners in. So now think about that for a second. But again, we're tracing the history of slavery and its consequences at Andersonville. Andersonville is also then a place where freedom was denied. As you guys well know, the 1890s Jim Crow laws became the law of the land. The local population began to send out, the local white population began to send militias to the cemetery to control the crowd at Memorial Day, as if they needed to be controlled. In 1891, they made Memorial Day invitation only. And you can guess who was not invited. But the black community fought back. In 1890, there were 4,000 the local newspaper records that there were 4,000 African Americans at Andersonville. When word spread that they weren't going to be allowed to visit the site in 1891 for their traditional celebration of putting out the flags and thanking these soldiers for their freedoms, 20,000 showed up the next year in protest. 20,000 African Americans descending on Andersonville in 1891. An increase of over 16,000, and they're doing so simply because they were told, you can't be here. And they weren't allowed on the site, but they surrounded it and had a celebration anyway. This got people a little concerned, and so they began to shut this system down. Between 1892 and 1908, African Americans were systematically excluded from this site that they held dear. Eventually, the rail company stopped running trains to Andersonville. But that didn't really keep the crowds away. They finally were able to stop these crowds. And in 1908, the local newspaper, the America's Times Recorder, reported that, and I'm reading here, this is a quote, and the GAR post at Fitzgerald will doubtless go there as usual for the memorial exercises, but there will be no Negro demonstrations there as in years past. Saturday there will be no special trains, nor will there be any reduced rates from Americus or other points. The Americus Light Infantry will go to Andersonville to support Sheriff E.L. Bell and his posse. The grand jury will be in session here then, and any black reveler who kicks up a rumpus will be skated to the chain gang instantly. The nigger discussion is a thing of the past. By the start of World War I, Andersonville had become a quiet, largely forgotten spot in rural Georgia. In the 1940s, burials for African Americans were resumed, for black veterans were resumed, but in a segregated way. Section G of Andersonville National Cemetery is still segregated. It was in operation from the early 1940s until 1960. If you were a black veteran and you died during those times and you wanted to be buried in a national cemetery, you were sectioned off. Now today, that's not marked. And so this is, again, Memorial Day from this past year. Folks putting flags out in a segregated section that they have no idea is segregated. Getting ahead of myself here. When I used to teach high school, I often made the mistake. I would say, hey, the work of the Civil Rights Movement, man, it was great. We don't have segregation anymore. Now, I've since learned, and now I often walk people into Section G, and I point out, how wrong was I? Here you are, you can stand in this cemetery, and it's still segregated. We're not going to dig these guys up and move them around. This is a part of our past we have to deal with. But it's a part of our past that we embrace it. Andersonville, despite its troubles, is also a site of civil rights triumph. In the early 1960s, the U.S. Army, who was running the cemetery at the time, made the decision without any kind of fanfare to desegregate Andersonville National Cemetery. And soon it received national attention as a beacon of equality and honor. In May of 1966, 19-year-old paratrooper Jimmy Williams from the small town of Wetumpka, Alabama, was killed in Vietnam. His hometown cemetery did everything in its power to prevent his internment in the local cemetery. There's no room, was the reason given. Although not much effort was made to find room, other than to offer his mother a plot in the pauper cemetery. Hardly a place befitting of the town's first casualty of that war. His mother finally gave up fighting the town, and she noted, I'm quoting his mother here, "My son died fighting on the front for all of us. He didn't die a segregated death, and he'll not be buried in a segregated cemetery." Memorial Day. Beautifully, Memorial Day, 1966. Once again, a black family spent that day in Andersonville National Cemetery, contemplating freedom, sacrifice, and loss. The American Missionary Association was right in my opinion, to call Andersonville the high watermark of slavery. Dr. Martin Luther King once said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. At no other site in our national landscape can the entire arc from slavery to freedom, to Jim Crow, to justice, and to equality be seen by the modern visitor. Those men suffered and died because our government demanded equality of treatment for all, even if it meant equality in suffering and in death. Next time you visit Andersonville, take a moment to walk the grounds and think about this as you soak in what happened there. Walk into the cemetery and think about Reverend Snelson leading people down those avenues, singing hymns and patriotic songs in celebration of emancipation. Imagine a sea of black people quietly moving amongst those white marble stones as they place flags at each and every soldier's grave and literally say thank you. Visit the grave of James H. Gooding, 54th Massachusetts Infantry, and think about his personal appeal to President Lincoln for equal pay for black soldiers, which he made less than a year before his death in captivity, and was buried equally alongside his comrades in arms of all races. Finally, visit the grave of Jimmy Williams. He's buried alongside a white soldier who was also killed in Vietnam, thus fulfilling his mother's wishes. Andersonville may have had a troubled past, but today it stands as a testament to all Americans' desire for freedom. The struggle for equality here in South Georgia did not begin in the 1950s and 60s. No, since 1864, Andersonville has been a place where Americans of all races have fought for, suffered, died, and even celebrated so that all might be free and equal. At the January 1st, 1869 Emancipation Day service, participants celebrated their freedom by gathering around the flagpole and singing "My Country, 'Tis of Thee." And I can think of no better way for us to acknowledge our own complex past and to celebrate our own freedoms than by mirroring their actions. Please join along with me, the Freedom Singers. As I like to do this at the end of programs in the cemetery. I often end my cemetery tours with, we circle up around the flagpole and we sing. Sometimes people get a little bit uncomfortable and they walk off. I am a horrible singer. I'm gonna cover this microphone up a little bit. But please join with me and the Freedom Singers as we sing "My Country, 'Tis of Thee."
So we can cover you.
Okay. All right.
There you go.
My country
is of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's bride, from every mountainside, let freedom ring.
Thank you all for allowing me to come out and allowing Andersonville to be represented here. And I'd encourage you guys to next time you have a chance to come out and visit the site. Not all of this is always in our exhibits, but all of us that work there are more than happy to talk about it. We do have, I mentioned Corporal Gooding. One of the things that the Park Service is doing is they've got these cards that we're passing out to visitors that share some of the individual stories, and we made a special point to make sure that Corporal Gooding is one of our cards. Additionally, we've got brochures that are back there that kind of highlight some of this as well, and also just kind of a shameless shameless plug for our park in September. We're the National Prisoner of War Museum, so we tell the story of prisoners of war throughout American history. And in September, Iraq War POW, former POW Shoshana Johnson will be visiting with us. She's going to be speaking at the Rylander Theater on, make sure I get the date right, Thursday, September 19th. And then she'll be with us in the park on Friday the 20th. So again, thank you guys for having us out.
Give this man another round of applause. Corporal Gooding here?
Ma'am?
Is that Corporal Gooding?
Yes, this is Corporal Gooding here.
Oh, he's not here in person.
No, he's buried in our cemetery.
Although sometimes I feel,
Oh, I'm sorry, this was dead.
although sometimes I feel like he's with me all the time. So he's one of my guys. Every Memorial Day, every holiday.
I was trying to identify, and that's what I was trying to identify. I'm sorry, sir. Stand up, will you? And come forward and say a word or two to us. That's who I got mixed up, anything good. I was trying to get your attention because I wanted to recognize you and have you say a word or two to us.
Well, thank you. I came down and met Joy over the winter time, was it? Early spring, sometime earlier this year. And I just want to thank Joy and the whole board for welcoming us here and allowing us this opportunity to tell these stories. And I'm very thankful for Chris Barr for bringing these stories to light. And again, I'd like to echo Chris's invitation. Please come visit us at Andersonville. Bring your family and friends. There's a lot of stories, a lot of history that, especially a lot of kids, they don't go up on a field trip and might not know exists. So please help spread the word. It's a national park. All of you own it. It belongs to everybody. And thank you again for having me.
Thank you very much. As the presentation was being made, didn't hear much from you. Audibly, but silently, I heard a lot of learning, a lot of awareness coming forward from you. You have to make that trip to Andersonville. We have to get this word out to our young people so that they will know and continue to learn where they come from, the struggles that was created before now, because our kids don't even know where our food comes from. They think they get everything out of the supermarket. If we were to close all the supermarkets, all the clothing stores, all the Burger Kings, and all the McDonald's, kids would know where to get nothing to eat from, would they? But some of us know how to. We know where to get food from, those things that are necessary for life. And our kids' history helped them make better decisions in the future. You gotta come, guys, to the Albany Civil Rights Center. Also, if you don't know the story, you need to learn. It's not over yet. The journey is still. Trayvon will also be an example to you that the struggle is still. I'm afraid to let my young man wear, what you call them things? A hoodie outside. I'm afraid. He may be picked out to be picked on. We have got to teach our young people where they come from, the history of their story, their life. And Andersonville is one of the great sites we need to go see if we don't know that story, so we can pass that on. It is our responsibility to pass that on to our kids so that they will know where they come from and put a value on things where they don't do that so much now. Okay, any discussions about what has happened here today? Anybody got any remarks they want to make? Any remarks? Anything you like especially? Anything different you might want to see? Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to ask a question of Mr. Barr.
lot of information, or did you find it easy, or did you along the way discover some of the information that you shared with us? I mean, what direction did you go
Well,
in that direction?
one of the things, that is a very complicated question, well, a complicated answer rather. I grew up in Americus, with the public schools in Americus, and several of my teachers, as well as my high school principal, who I was very close to, were very involved in the movement in the 60s. Several of them endured captivity, and so I grew up very much being kind of exposed to this story, very much an interest in that story. And about a year ago or so, I was working on some stuff, put together a cemetery program and this kind of thing, and I stumbled across this letter that was digitized. There's a website out there, it's called archive.org, where basically they're digitizing old books from the 1880s, 1870s, 1890s, this kind of thing. And so that includes congressional records. And I found a letter written to a congressman named Charles Sumner, who was a very staunch abolitionist and this kind of thing. But it was written to him describing this January 1st Emancipation Day service. And my ears were thinking, what's going on? Oh, hold up now. This is a story right here. What's going on here? Because these guys, they don't just come out of nowhere and they don't just disappear into nothing. This story's got to come from somewhere. And so that's really what started that journey. As we start to talk about, how other prisoners see things, there's lots of published prisoner memoirs that are out there. Lots of prisoners testified before Congress. All of that is out there in records. Now, again, most people have read those documents and stuff, looking at it, saying, well, how do they suffer? What are they eating? This kind of thing. But as you start to look through it, it's almost every one of these things will have a line in there. Well, I was about to die, but this slave snuck me a loaf of bread, or I tried to escape and this slave snuck me this, or I was making my escape and this slave hid me in their quarters for 3 days while the Confederate patrols were looking for me. And so you start to see all of this stuff, and then as we really started digging into the post-war, the 1880s, 1890s, the America's Times Reporter, the local newspaper, was really kind of a big source of information on that. Now, that's both a blessing and a curse, because you're dealing with a newspaper that was being written by white Americans in the 1880s and 1890s, and they have a very decided slant, as the one article that I quoted from indicates. But from that you could glean things like numbers, you could glean things like, okay, what are they doing, when are they doing it, and this kind of thing. So it's been really, really fascinating. I'm one of those people that if you drop me off at a library somewhere and just throw away the key, I'll go get lost in dusty stacks somewhere, and I'll have the time of my life. So it's been a challenge trying to do some of this research. My last semester of graduate school, one of my courses I took was a course on slavery and emancipation, and so that really kind of provided a professor to put a deadline on getting this done in large part too. So that was the big goal.
It's vitally important that your information goes beyond Andersonville, because what is so outstanding and awesome about it is that you show the connection for each segment of whatever you link all together. And that's also how the music works. It shows the connection and how it was used and how it influenced what and what impacted what. So that's what's interesting. Very interesting.
Exactly, a great timeline from the beginning to now.
I'm going away from the timeline. You mentioned that the barriers at Andersonville, you can't tell what race.
And what was going on when soldiers died at Andersonville? Their buddies would just simply write their name and their regiment on basically a tag. The Army didn't have dog tags back then, and so they would basically make a rudimentary dog tag, and the hospital clerks would record that. And so this is a typical Civil War headstone at Andersonville. It's usually first initial, last name, rank. If they're private, there's no rank given. It's just kind of assumed into the state he's from. Unless you just happen to know J.H. Gooding, Corporal, Massachusetts, is 54th Massachusetts.
And that's even today.
Yeah, even today. Now, there are some minor exceptions to this in the Civil War section. Some soldiers, some of the black soldiers that were prisoners were members of regiments called the United States Colored Troops, USCTs. And so because they don't have a state regimental designation, some of their headstones will say USCT, but most of them will just simply say USA, or will say Massachusetts, or whatever the case may be. And they were buried they didn't have a separate section. They were just buried right in the order that they died in. They're very slit trenches, just shoulder to shoulder. And so, then in the 1940s, there was a segregated section, which we talked a little bit about. And so, that section today it's a separate section, but you don't realize it's a separate section unless you just happen to pay attention to the little stone markers that say section G, section D, or whatever the case may be. The segregated section is segregated by space about that big. So, but yeah, unless you just happen to know the person, you have no idea.